It's a great opening to our conference, I think, laying out all the reasons why Azerbaijan is important for the United States, both in strategic, security, and economic terms, and also laying out some of the concerns and issues that we bilaterally do need to talk about in our relationship. So I think the next order of speaker will be David Kramer, the Honorable David Kramer, who is a former Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Labor, and Human Rights. He is currently a Senior Transatlantic Fellow at the German Marshall Fund, and he's working on issues related to Russia, Eurasia, as well as democracy and human rights. And he has a very interesting op-ed piece in today's Washington Post, albeit on the decision on missile defense, not directly connected to what we're discussing today. David is a longtime friend and colleague. I have great respect for all of his work. Before he was Assistant Secretary, he was in the State Department. He was Deputy Assistant Secretary for European and Eurasian Affairs, and he was responsible for Russia, Ukraine, Moldova, and Belarus. Also non-proliferation issues. Before that, he worked in the Office of Policy Planning. He worked in the Office of the Undersecretary for Global Affairs. And prior to that, he was Executive Director of the U.S. Advisory Commission on Public Diplomacy. So we are delighted that you could come. You've also just, I know, returned from Europe, so you're in some time zone, but we're delighted to have you. So please join me in welcoming David Kramer.
Thank you very much, Angela. I appreciate the very kind introduction, and we do indeed go back quite a ways, but it's a real pleasure to be here. I've actually never been in this building, this part of the campus, so I'm delighted to broaden my academic horizons in that respect. But my thanks certainly to the Center and to Georgetown, and also, of course, to the Embassy of Azerbaijan for co-sponsoring and organizing this conference and inviting me to join you here today. As you mentioned, I am just back Wednesday night from a trip to Europe, so I'm used to people falling asleep while I speak, but if I fall asleep while I speak, you'll understand why now. It's also a great pleasure to be on a panel with Deputy Foreign Minister Azimov, and had the pleasure of working with him last year while I was still in the government on a difficult issue between the U.S. and Azerbaijan, the issue of human rights and democratization, and I'll come to that in a little bit in my remarks. In preparing for today, I was trying to think of issues to cover that Undersecretary Burns would not cover, and I very much appreciated his presentation here this morning. Bill is one of the best diplomats we have in the U.S. government, a man of great experience and wisdom, and somebody I have enormous respect for. And I thought he laid out the U.S.-Azerbaijan agenda very, very capably. So rather than recover some of the ground that he's already touched on, I want to try to cover a few issues that Bill didn't have time to go into in great detail. But I do also want to start out by saying that Azerbaijan clearly is a friend of the United States, and I hope that Azerbaijan views the United States in the same way that we are a friend of Azerbaijan. As Undersecretary Burns said, we have major interests in Azerbaijan in the three areas that he identified. Those include energy diversification, security cooperation, and democratic and economic reform. And certainly our two countries enjoy great cooperation and an excellent, healthy relationship in the area of energy diversification, with Azerbaijan emerging as more and more a crucial supplier of oil and diversified natural gas supplies for our European allies, and that obviously has great benefits for the United States as well. On security, Bill mentioned the very important contributions Azerbaijan has made to international peacekeeping efforts, most notably in Afghanistan, Iraq, Kosovo, and also provides important support for ongoing ISAF efforts in Afghanistan. So our relationship between the two countries in these areas of energy and security is a very healthy one, as Undersecretary Burns described. That said, our strongest relationships around the world are with countries that do respect fully the human rights of their citizens, in addition to sharing values and interests with us, and fulfilling the great potential of the relationship between our two countries. I think Azerbaijan should be no exception in this area. And so we seek to bring our cooperation in the area of human rights up to the level that we have with security and energy. And it's my firm hope that we will see greater movement in this area, and I will come back to this issue in a few minutes. Azerbaijan, of course, is in a tough neighborhood. It's located between Russia's very troubled and volatile North Caucasus and Iran, so it can't do much about its geography. But I think it can become a model for countries in the region through launching serious liberalization in both democratic and economic reform, and it is in that we pin great hopes on Azerbaijan's future to become that model. And the purpose here is not solely to become a model. It's for its own good. Azerbaijan's development in these areas should first and foremost serve its own purposes. I'm going to touch on a few issues, as the title of our conference here suggests, new bilateral and regional dimensions, and I want to touch on a few that have not already been covered in Undersecretary Burns' comments. The first, I am actually going to touch on missile defense. Since my return to D.C. Wednesday night, I've been focused on this issue. And there is, I think, actually considerable relevance for Azerbaijan concerning missile defense. Specifically, if you look at the press conference that Secretary of Defense Gates and General Cartwright gave yesterday, the issue of radars came up. And it's noteworthy, I think, to focus on the answer that General Cartwright gave when he was asked about deployment of an X-band radar in Europe. And the question was, do you know where that would be, the future deployment of such an X-band radar in Europe? Could it still be in the Czech Republic? And the general's answer, I think, has considerable bearing on Azerbaijan. He said, it's probably more likely to be in the Caucasus that we would base that because it's to get the early tracks. So that would likely be more down in the Caucasus. Now, of the 3 Caucasus states, only one has such a radar facility already. I don't think we have in mind construction of a new radar facility in either Armenia or Georgia. There certainly is the Armavir radar facility in southern Russia, but I don't think that's necessarily what the general had in mind, though I don't think he rules out Armavir either. But Gabala, I think, is very much on the mind of the administration here. Another journalist went on to ask, can you explain why X-band radar in the Caucasus might be less of a threat to Russia than the Czech radar, and what is, by 2011, how many medium-range missiles from Iran could they conceivably launch toward Europe? And the general goes on to answer, on the X-band radar, what we're trying to get, the first question really has to do with Russia and their perception of a threat from the radar that would have been in the Czech Republic. And that radar is omnidirectional in nature. In other words, it sees 360 degrees. And has a very deep peering capability into Russia. The general goes on to say, and the worry would be that we would be able to then to see very early the launches if Russia were launching their ICBMs. As a parenthetical, I would hope we could see their ICBMs should they be launched, but editorial comment aside. And that could be perceived as destabilizing. And here's the important phrase. The X-band radar is single directional. In other words, when you put it down, it points in a single direction. And it will be very clear that it is pointing south towards Iran. Again, I think clearly here the general has in mind Gabala. So yesterday's decision by the administration, I think, is very important for Azerbaijan. And I have supported, since the day President Putin raised cooperation at Gabala and Amavir, further cooperation with Russia on this issue, but just as importantly with Azerbaijan, since in fact Gabala sits on its territory. This issue, I think, is going to take on greater importance. Another issue, Iran, and developments in neighboring Iran. I would argue that of any country, Azerbaijan perhaps has the greatest interest in what's happening in its neighbor, Roughly a quarter of Iran's population of 66 million people is Azeri. Roughly, this is about twice the size of Azerbaijan's population of 8 million. And it heightens even more the importance of what's happening in Iran. Of course, the main challenger in the June presidential election, who reportedly is not very popular, Ahmadinejad rather, is not very popular in the Azeri-Iranian community, was Hussein Mousavi, who is an ethnic Azeri. And the reaction of the government to developments in Iran, though, despite those demographic considerations, was to congratulate Ahmadinejad on his election victory. And in fact, 3 days after the Iranian election, President Aliyev sent a letter of congratulations expressing confidence that Azerbaijani-Iranian relations would, quote, continue strengthening to meet our people's interests. Azerbaijan's pro-government television channels offered limited coverage of the post-election protest, reflecting, I would argue, a nervousness on the part of the government in Baku. I think by contrast, if you look at some of the coverage in print media or on the web, particularly those, frankly, affiliated with the opposition, there's been significantly more coverage of developments in Iran post-June 12. The bottom line, I think, and Minister Azimov can correct me if I'm wrong, is I think the government in Baku feels that developments in Iran are the internal affairs of Iran and not a matter for other countries to be commenting on or meddling in. Third issue is the Russian invasion of Georgia last August. I visited Baku twice last year when I was in the State Department in June and then in November. And I was struck when I was there in November about how fresh the war between Russia and Georgia still was in Baku and the sense of concern that was palpable. There was a lot of annoyance with President Saakashvili and the actions that he undertook in August of last year, but there was also considerable concern about the Russian actions in Georgia. And that, too, I think, is going to continue. I think the Russian actions in Georgia have had reverberations not just in Azerbaijan but elsewhere in the region and have actually wound up, paradoxically, leading to a reduction in Russian influence along countries, along its borders. And I think Azerbaijan is no exception to that. And that, too, will, the situation between Russia and Georgia last year, I think will continue to be a factor as Azerbaijan continues to figure out its interest in deepening integration with the Euro-Atlantic community. And certainly Azerbaijan has taken a positive step in that direction, including at the May 7th summit with EU officials in Prague, where it became one of 6 members of the Eastern Partnership Initiative, which I think is a very positive step, both between the EU and countries like Azerbaijan, as well as the other 5 states that were signatories to that. That, I think, represents a good positive step in the right direction for Azerbaijan's deeper integration into Euro-Atlantic community, which should not, by the way, come at Russia's expense. Undersecretary Burns was talking about rejecting zero-sum thinking. It's important, I think, for people in Baku, but more importantly in Moscow, to understand that Azerbaijan's improvement of relations with Europe and with the United States need not come at the expense of Russia. Azerbaijan can and, in fact, should have good, strong relations with Russia. It should also have good, strong relations with the West. And those, I think, are mutually compatible interests, not mutually exclusive interests. Lastly, given my last position in the government as Assistant Secretary for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, I would be terribly remiss if I didn't spend a few minutes talking about the human rights situation in Azerbaijan. And let me be clear. I do this as a friend of Azerbaijan. I want to see Azerbaijan succeed. I want to see Azerbaijan prosper as a democratic, market-oriented country fully integrated into the Euro-Atlantic community. So any criticisms I may voice are not because I enjoy criticizing the government in Baku or governments elsewhere, but it's out of self-interest, frankly, because we do feel the countries that are moving on a democratic path are the most reliable and stable partners for the United States. In testimony June 16th before the House European Subcommittee on Foreign Affairs, the new Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, Phil Gordon, noted Azerbaijan's importance as, quote, I'm going to read a paragraph here, a partner on regional security, especially counterterrorism, and on helping our European allies diversify their supply of natural gas. Azerbaijan also exports nearly 1 million barrels of oil per day to global markets via the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline, free from geographic choke points and from monopolistic pressures. All true. Wouldn't disagree with a single word. But unfortunately, in his testimony, it was not focused on Azerbaijan, it was on the region as a whole. Assistant Secretary Gordon neglected to say a single word about Azerbaijan's democratic development and human rights situation. And I would argue that the lack of democratic development in Azerbaijan is a concern and even a danger for the country, because it runs the risk of producing the very kinds of unrest and commotion that no one wants to see in that country. In February, my old bureau released its annual human rights report, as it does every year, hence the name, hence the annual human rights report. And it put the situation on Azerbaijan this way: the government's human rights record remained poor and worsened in some areas. It faulted Azerbaijan's presidential election last October for, quote, serious restrictions on political participation in the media, pressure and restrictions on observers, and flawed vote counting and tabulation processes. It also cited harassment, arbitrary arrests, and detentions of critics, political opponents, as well as restrictions on freedom of assembly. Now, I have heard from the times I went to Azerbaijan last year concerns that the criticism of Azerbaijan's record is inconsistent and uneven. Azerbaijan is held to a standard different from that of, say, neighboring Armenia and Georgia. And I understand those concerns. In the trip I took in June, I made a point of going first to Tbilisi and Yerevan before I went to Baku, in order to focus on the deficiencies of human rights in both of those countries. And in both places, I made a point of speaking out publicly and clearly about the shortcomings that we saw. In the case of Armenia, where 10 people were killed after March 2008 presidential elections, and where we have been pressing for resolution and accountability in that matter. In Georgia, which went through a state of emergency in November 2007, and elections that were not perfect by any means last year. Here, too, I tried to stress the importance of respect for human rights and democratic development in those two countries. So I understand the concerns that are voiced in Baku about this. And I would agree that we can and should be doing a better job of focusing attention on the shortcomings in those two countries. But at the same time, we can't turn a blind eye to what's happening in Azerbaijan itself. Similarly, when I was in Baku both times last year, I heard Nagorno-Karabakh cited as a reason why there couldn't be full freedom of the press or freedom of assembly. And I even heard this, perhaps most disturbingly for me, from journalists who were training, who were in university. I would argue that this argument should be rejected wholeheartedly. I would argue that the unresolved conflict of Nagorno-Karabakh is not a valid reason for either country, frankly, to avoid respecting media freedom or engaging in other essential components of democratization. To the contrary, I would argue that the conflict heightens the importance of serious discussion on both sides of how to achieve a peaceful resolution to the conflict, and I appreciated Undersecretary Burns' comments on the conflict specifically. Last year, the government threatened to close down radio stations, Radio Liberty, Voice of America, BBC broadcasts, rather, of these networks. And this was an issue that I raised in many meetings with government officials last year. Unfortunately, despite what I thought was an understanding that the broadcasts would continue while good faith efforts were underway, the broadcasts were in fact cut off. I hope we can find a way to get them restored. March referendum eliminating term limits for the president runs the risk of creating the grounds for presidency for life for Ilham Aliyev, given his control of the political landscape. And there were some journalists released. This was an issue also I had raised while I was there. But unfortunately, there has been further cases of harassment of journalists. An NGO law was passed that runs the risk of creating tremendous problems for NGOs and their ability to operate freely in the country. That, too, is a concern. And then, more recently, the arrests of two bloggers, Adnan Hajizadeh and Amin Mili, in July, who were in a restaurant, got into a fight, went to the police station to report what happened, and they wound up being arrested. They had been critics of the government, satirists, and many are concerned that because of that criticism, because of the things that they were posting on the web, that they wound up being persecuted, and they continue to face the prospect of further jail time. Corruption is a problem, as Undersecretary Burns mentioned, and this is an issue that we want to help Azerbaijan with in dealing. Corruption can be a cancer for any country, Azerbaijan being no exclusion to that, but of course the benefits from the energy boom create the fertile grounds for even further corruption, and we hope that that is an issue that gets addressed. I sincerely hope, after my trips last year to Azerbaijan, what I found were very interesting and useful and constructive meetings with President Aliyev, who I have to really express appreciation for spending as much time as he did with me when I went there, in very lengthy meetings talking about these issues, both in philosophical terms as well as in concrete terms. I genuinely hope that President Aliyev, strengthened with the mandate he received from last year's election and with the referendum this past March, undertakes the necessary steps toward liberalization and democratization in his country. There are factions in the government and in political circles in Baku who don't want to move in this direction. We should side with those who do want to move in the right direction and try to marginalize as much as possible those who do not. We need to continue to push on freedom of the press. We need to continue to push on restoration of the international broadcasts. We need to continue to push on respect for opposition and freedom of assembly in Azerbaijan. We need to push on all these fronts. When President Aliyev, during an April 2006 visit to Washington, met with President Bush, he said the following: "We are grateful for the United States' assistance in promotion of the political process, the process of democratization of our society, and are very committed to continuing this cooperation in the future." And it was taking that as sincere expression that I went to Baku twice last year to press on these difficult and important issues. And it's also very important that pushing on these issues not be the message solely of the Assistant Secretary for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. Ambassador Dursey was very supportive of these issues, but other officials from the U.S. government, as well as officials from Europe, need to have the issue of human rights and democratization on their agenda, whether they're there to discuss energy deals, whether they're there to discuss security cooperation. It's very important that the government in Baku understand that the issues of human rights and democratization are just as important to the United States as the very strong relationships we have with Azerbaijan in the areas of energy diversification and security cooperation. So I think with that, Angela, let me stop there and again express my appreciation for the opportunity to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, David, for a very rich presentation.